Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Center for Fiction. My name is Melanie McNair. I'm the Senior Director of Public Programming here. We are the only literary nonprofit that supports and celebrates the creation and enjoyment of fiction. And we like to say that we celebrate storytelling in all its forms. But if I may be a little bit self-critical, we don't do nearly enough programming with books in which cats are worshipped. So I just need to do a quick poll. How many of you already worship cats? Okay, see? Yeah. Well, I'm excited that tonight that we'll do a little exploration into the intersections of fantasy and historical and literary fiction, and thank you so much for joining us for that. How many of you are visiting for the first time tonight? All right, well, you're welcome, and please sign up for our mailing list and come back and see us. A couple of housekeeping announcements. We will have an audience Q&A tonight, and if you're here in person, raise your hand and somebody will bring you a microphone so that the people who are watching on our live broadcast can hear your question as well. And if you're watching on the broadcast, hello also, and you can type your question in the chat at any time. When the event is over, you may purchase the books from the bookstore and come back here to have your books personalized. And a couple of exciting things for those. We did a book giveaway for those of you who are here tonight, and I've got the names for the drawing. So 3 people will get copies of the book: Destiny Adams, Kirsten Gonzalez, and Ash Gilliam. So congratulations. All right. Let me introduce our fabulous authors. Owen King is the author of the Curator double feature, and we're all in this together, a novella and stories. He's the co-author of Sleeping Beauties, an intro to Alien Invasion, and the co-editor of Who Can Save Us Now? Brand new superheroes and their amazing short stories. He is joining us from upstate where he lives with his family. And Anna North is the author of 3 novels: Outlawed, a New York Times bestseller and Reese Book Club pick, America Pacifica, and The Life and Death of Sophie Stark, which received a Lambda Literary Award in 2016. A graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop, she's been a writer and editor at Jezebel, BuzzFeed, Salon, and the New York Times, and is now a senior correspondent at Vox, covering American work and family life. She grew up in LA and lives in Brooklyn. Please welcome them both to the stage.
Anybody hear us?
All right.
All right. I am so excited to be here to talk about this wonderful novel, The Curator. Thank you so much, all of you, for coming. This book is so dark and so fun and appeals to a wide variety of readers. I have a 4-year-old son, and I was telling him a small anecdote from the book. If folks have read it, there's a part where a magician, for his most famous trick, switches heads with a member of the audience. And my son was like, "Now you have to read me that part." And so I said, "Okay." And so I read it, and he's like, "Okay, you just have to keep reading." And he made me read to him for like 20 minutes, and I had to skip like a lot of parts. But this is, he ordinarily will only read picture books, so this is a ringing endorsement of, not only is this very fascinating, but also entertaining even for the short attention span preschooler. So,
that is extraordinarily, that is a tough audience.
Yes,
right?
He's a very tough audience. So yeah, I can't wait to delve into this with an audience of adults. Just to start, will you talk a little? I know this was a short story first.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about what the germ of that story was. How did this project come to be?
Well, I got asked to contribute a story to an anthology that was supposed to be of sort of broken novel starts, and I didn't have one, but I still wanted to be in the book. And so I asked them if I could just make one up, and they said sure. And so I just sat down, and it's not an especially, it's not a way I normally would write something, but I was just riffing, and I had the sentence that was, I was just trying different things. And I just came up with a sentence that said something like, after the coup d'etat, Dee contrived to become the curator of the National Museum of the Worker, or something like that. And I got, of the sentences that I've been writing, I looked at that one and I thought to myself, well, that was interesting that she contrived to do it. And then I started thinking about who she was and what the museum might be like. And about 15 minutes later, I had this story in mind, and I got into it, and I wrote a 40-page story in about a week, which is super fast for me. And I just had a blast kind of finding my way through this world that felt a little bit like ours, but also just a little bit different, and exploring this strange museum where the main character gains the curatorship after this revolution has occurred. And by the time I was done with the story, I was like, wow, I could tell there was a whole bunch of stuff around the edges of it, because the story all takes place in the museum. And all the 70% of the book is all things outside the museum, and I really knew what it was that was happening, but there wasn't room in the story for it. And I thought to myself, well, I don't know, maybe I'll come back to it. But everybody responded so positively to the story that it made me feel like, oh, there's an audience for something like this that's a little bit fantastical, but also has a grounding to it in a world that feels pretty real. And so then I started writing the book, and it was easier in a lot of ways because I knew some of the things that were going to happen. And I knew when I write something, I have to convince myself I know what the ending is. And the ending of the story is pretty different from the ending of the book, but I had that ending, so I was like, well, I'm just going to drive towards this. And it just tricked myself into thinking that I could do it, and so I could. And it was definitely the most fun, which isn't always a good sign, right? I mean, like, how many times have you read a book where there's somebody that's like up to some metafictional hijinks where you can tell that they're having, a delightful time writing it, but you're the one who has to read it. But I did have a great time writing it, and hopefully people do like to read it.
That's awesome. It's interesting that you talk about sort of, the spaces around the museum, and also, the sense of where this is set. I wanted to talk to you, to kind of open it up, I wanted to talk to you about setting, but both the question of where is this set and when is this set are both really vexed questions, I think.
Yeah.
And neither of which has an obvious answer. But talk to me a little bit about the setting of this book.
Sure. Well, I just want to say it's really interesting because I hadn't read your latest book, Outlawed, until before we set up to do this. I'd read your book, The Life and Death of Sophie Stark, which I loved. But your book is similar in a lot of ways, in the way that in Anna's book, Outlawed, it's inhabiting a version of the 1890s American West that is both really familiar and distinctly different. Right. And so you're constantly weaving through a world that you recognize from film and books, but then it's departing at surprising points. And the Curators is not as specific as that. But it is similar in the sense that it's a city in the Victorian era. It feels a little bit 1890s-ish, and the city is unnamed, but it's definitely on a Earth version of some kind, right? There's two moons, but there's also Constantinople's a place in it, and Cuba's a place in it, and the locations that are referenced, there's a handful of them through the book, they do tend to pin the book down in a certain range of years, but on a planet that's definitely different since it has two moons, right? And then the city itself is a mix of London and New York and Vienna, and there's one location in the book that comes directly from research, which is there's a place that a number of characters become involved with, which is this morgue ship where the bodies of criminals are displayed, and that's based on a real thing that I read about in a book called The Killer of Little Shepherds, by Douglas Starr, where the people in Lyon, France, it was where the medical school conducted its work on the study of dead bodies, and then eventually the ship broke away and crashed, which is really horrible. I mean, not that it's not horrible enough. And so that's a very specific thing that came from this city in France, and that I stuck it in a version of it in my city. So that was the making of the place.
That's great. I kept, the whole time I was reading, I kept thinking about the wasteland, thinking about an unreal city. And then also weirdly a little bit of the China Miéville book, The City in the City.
Yeah.
This is obviously very different, but there's that certain sort of like, what kind of universe are we inhabiting, and sort of portals, without giving too much away, portals where people might be traversing in not normal ways of traveling.
Yeah, and the other world part of it, I think, is it's okay to sort of imply that that's happening, because the whole idea of the book is that Dee, at the start of the book, she wants to get a position on a certain street for reasons that don't seem and that aren't entirely clear, and it turns out she's not exactly who we thought she was, and the street isn't exactly what we thought it was, and the revolution isn't at all what we thought it was. And so the whole structure, if it works, is supposed to be like one little box opening on another little box, and everything is something different than what it first seemed. And hopefully that's enjoyable and not maddening.
Yeah, the other thing I kept thinking about as I was reading this was the concept of like a puzzle box novel or a puzzle box TV show. And then I was like, they call everything a puzzle box nowadays. What's a puzzle box novel? But I do think there is this sense, and I like, I like the blurb, like intensely satisfying, because there is this sense that you're sort of, you open a box, and then towards the end you sort of start to begin to close the boxes, and you're like, oh, that's how the box closes, or that's how the box opens, which is like a really nice, I think, feeling for the reader. But talk to us a little bit more about Dee, who also goes by Dora. She's, she really drives a lot of the story and is sort of the core character. How did you sort of get inside her head?
Well, I think the first thing is that she's Dee to herself, but she's Dora to everybody else, and that's supposed to, it's an indication to the reader that there's something about her that's not connecting here with the world, right? That the world is thinking of her one way and she's thinking of herself in another way. She's definitely loosely inspired by Little Dorrit from the Dickens novel, which is one of my favorites. Very loosely inspired, because Little Dorrit is kind of a saintly figure. And I think that Dee is, to me, she's the kind of heroine I love, because she's pretty deeply flawed in certain ways. And she's definitely not saintly. But she's a domestic worker and an orphan, and what I loved about writing her was, the challenge is that in a Victorian society like the one that she's inhabiting, the position for somebody like her is to sort of be not seen or heard, right? And what I liked about writing her was figuring out ways that demonstrated that she was the smartest and the cleverest and could solve the mysteries that no one else had been able to solve. And I just got so enamored of that kind of underdog character, who also had stuff that wasn't perfect about her, and it made her a more satisfying protagonist to write about than any that I can think that I've worked on before. It made it hard to leave her, because she was so much fun that way, and saw things that people didn't know she was seeing.
Yeah, no, she's hard to leave as a reader too. She sticks with you. But to stay with character for a minute, talk a little bit. This is a book with a lot of characters, and it's also, I think I read this in a review, and it's really true that even the most minor characters are really very well fleshed out. You have a sense that they could go off and have a book, and that their names are very well considered, that the way they look is very well considered. They're sort of, their worlds unto themselves. Can you talk a little bit about just your process for creating this pretty big and well-populated city full of people?
Yeah, I think that what attracts me so much to Dickens novels and Trollope novels and Elizabeth Gaskell novels is that the worlds tend to be like there tends to be like this top to bottom view of the town or the city or wherever it's happening, and you meet people from all those different parts of the society, and they all feel like character actors. And I feel like if you're going to ask somebody to read a pretty long book, and the book is like 480 pages long, so it's pretty long, that you have to reward them with characters that all sound different and are all have like a pop to them, and without it being too cartoonish. They're characters, you know, and I just find that. I mean, it has a little bit of you see why Dickens novels make such good miniseries. You know, there's like a little bit of a series quality to having so many characters come up and come back. But that's kind of what entertains me as a reader the most, is to have this panorama of characters and have them appear, and then just try to find something. Some special quality about all of them that isn't necessarily the way they look. It's more like something that you know. I'm trying to think of you know, there's this horrible guy who is a debauched university student, and he ends up being kind of crucial to the plot, but we don't exactly know why. And I wanted to make sure that he was especially horrible, and I wanted to really demonstrate through him why people in the city were so upset. You know, he's very representative of the kind of the people that sort of had the power. But yeah, I mean, I just think it's important to make everybody almost like you can hear them. If you took away all the dialogue tags, you would always know who was talking, right? Without it. It's kind of what I go for.
Like a good exercise. We've been talking about Dickens a bunch, so I want to talk a little bit about influences.
Sure.
Obviously, you know, you can see and hear Dickens a lot in here, but I also was like hearing some Victor Hugo. It made me think about, I don't know if folks have read the novel The Phantom of the Opera, which I really recommend. It's so weird. It's just so strange. Like, I can't even tell you anything about it, but read it. And then I'm also hearing like some N.K. Jemisin, you know, The City We Became, and then also, I mean, we can talk about her a little bit more when we talk about the way that this book deals with magic, but I think there are some similarities. But tell me, you know, what writers, what other sort of cultural touchstones are you pulling from here in this book? What are the influences?
Well, one of the things I do, and I would be really curious to know if you're the same, is I try to read away from anything like what I'm writing, you know?
100%.
And so I thought all the time about Dickens and Trollope and Elizabeth Gaskell and Zola and things like that as I was writing the book, but I was just trying to like get the feel of them in the book. I didn't want to read them at all because then I would get them in the book and that would be horrible. So I think it's probably a mix of just thinking about those kind of books, and gosh, what else? I mean, I guess there's probably like a little bit of a like the magic in a John Irving book or like a Robertson Davies book, like a kind of there's like a little bit of a sparkle, you know, to those kinds of things. I'm sure that was an influence. And I think that when you read away from what you're writing, sometimes weird things can creep in and be helpful. You know, if I was, and I can't remember if I was, but if I read an Elmore Leonard book at some point as I was writing the book, I'm sure old Elmore snuck in there in some way, in the way that the people talked, you know? And yeah, it's not a very satisfying answer. But you know what was particularly influential as I read London Labor and the London Poor, I think it's called, by Henry Mayhew, because I wanted to get like the voices of where you really hear the quoted voices of people in the 19th century, and that was just thinking about the cadences and things like that. That was a big. So I do read nonfiction from the thing, but I don't read fiction.
Yeah, I mean, I'm the same people. So my last book was sort of a revisionist Western, people always are like, oh, have you read this Western? Have you read this Western? And I'm like, I have read Westerns before I started writing the book, and I now read Westerns again, but I did not read any Westerns for like 5 years, so probably no.
It just gets, it's a little stressful.
It's really stressful.
Because you're thinking to yourself all the time, is this even a little bit like something else? And the truth is there's definitely a bunch of things in any book you write that is going to be like something else, but you just cannot, I cannot stand to have it in my head hanging over me, you know?
No, I mean, I feel fine. I mean, I'm the same. Like, I feel fine if it's something different. Like, I watched a lot of heist movies while I was writing the book, because I needed to figure out, like, how to, like, people do big, like, bank heists. But I feel sort of, you know, if you're like being a magpie and like pulling and changing, it's fine. But if I'm reading something really close, then I get very nervous and worried. And I totally agree with you. But since you brought up the labor history, let's talk about research. How do you research for a book that is not set in reality?
Well, it makes it a lot easier. It makes it a lot easier, right? Because you can sort of apply the things that you want to use and not apply the things you don't want to use. But it can't be completely untethered. Like, you have to stick to the reality that you establish. And so once I decided there weren't going to be any cars, there's no cars. Yeah. Once I decided there was going to be a tram, like, it always had to be possible for people to ride the tram. And so I borrowed things from, you know, up and down different decades of the 19th century and stuck them in there, so the city isn't exactly right, but that's okay because it's an imaginary place, and it just has to be true to itself, and make sure that all the details line up, you know, from A to Z.
Did you draw a map for yourself?
I did draw. It's funny because the first chapter sort of tries to establish that you're visiting a place that's like something you know, but different by saying that it's unmappable.
Right.
But I did actually map some parts of it, and certainly there's a lot of action that takes place. Dee inhabits this strange sort of abandoned museum, and the museum is on a street where all the other buildings are museums or societies that also appear to be abandoned or mostly abandoned, and they're for very obscure subjects like there's a dollhouse museum and a clock museum, and early on you might think to yourself, well, this is a really weird thing that they bothered to do this. They have like these grand buildings where people are displaying these things, and so that part of the story, because some of the different buildings end up playing a part, that I really mapped closely. But the other things I just sort of had like south, north, east, west, and just a general sense of where they were.
Gotcha. This is like a little bit of a left turn, but I want to talk about grossness and sort of the uses of disgust in fiction. So there's a lot of really gross parts in this book. I mean, we can talk about some of them. And, you know, I think they work really well and are very viscerally disgusting, but they're also like sort of working towards something larger in terms of looking at actually class inequality, and in terms of looking at what is it like, you know, what would it have been like to really live in the 1890s in London or Paris or any of these places, which were actually super disgusting. And of course now we live in New York that's being overrun by rats that I recently learned have COVID. So it's like we already live somewhere disgusting here in 2023. So like talk a little bit about how you think about disgust, how it, you know, operates in fiction and in your fiction.
Well, I think the main thing is just I didn't want the portrait of the city to be gilded. I wanted readers to really feel how desperate it is for the most impoverished citizens, and I think that the really gross body stuff reminds us of the humanity. It really pulls you in. I read this. I read the Living Dead by George Romero. It was a George Romero novel that a writer named Daniel Kraus finished, and I remember, I'll never forget, this is like one of the grossest things ever, was that this one woman had survived in this building, but she'd been like wearing her clothes for so long that they had partially adhered to her skin and like grown mold. And I mean, it was really hard to read. But it also, I thought it was a great detail because it's like, she's been living on her own for 10 years in a, downtown DC. And of course this would happen because what else would happen? And so I think that those disgusting details ground us, and they make it more real, and they're surprising. I also think that they, by contrast, make the more magical things feel more real and more possible, because if the I think that when you're writing about supernatural events, everybody has a different ability to suspend their own disbelief. And for me, I can't suspend my own disbelief if the world where the magic stuff is happening, it doesn't feel super real. That's like a hang-up that I have. So for readers like me, I think that disgust helps make it seem possible.
That makes sense. Since we're started talking about magic and reality, I wanted to ask you a little bit about how magic operates in this book. I also think this could be a cool part to read. So while you answer this question, I will find the Simon the Gentle section and then hand it to you. But yeah, talk to me. So I think when I was reading this, this is one reason that I thought about Jemison's work, because there's that part in the Broken Earth series where you find out, I guess spoiler alert here, where you find out that orogeny, the sort of the spine of the entire series, this thing that the people can do is just magic. Mm-hmm. And there's a similar thing at play here, I think, where you're questioning, is someone doing sleight of hand? Is someone? What are the laws of physics? Who is following them? Who has made these laws and who is breaking them? So talk a little bit about how you thought about magic and reality when you're writing this. And I'm going to find this thing.
Yeah, I thought about it as, I thought about magic in the world of the story as basically a big secret that a lot of people suspect is going on, but that we don't know is really happening. And so through the setup of the book, it hopefully feels like everything is realistic to a large extent. And then as things go along and stranger things start happening, you wonder, but again, it all feels like it could just be gossip or rumor, and that strangeness builds until the magic sort of comes forth. And I hope that I again, sort of going back to that grounding, I sort of earn it from the reader by making things feel realistic until they're not.
That's great. Okay, I have found what I would like you to read, and just from this triangle to this triangle. It's about the vestibule.
Until he couldn't?
Yeah, just like this, that little bit.
Okay. The vestibule, as Simon the Gentle, that's the name of the conjurer, called his closet in this passage, was the core element of his most entrancing fantasy. How the conjurer obtained the vestibule, whether he designed it himself or came to possess it some other way, was never determined. To begin, the Gentle asked for the assistance of a beautiful woman from the audience. Once the volunteer joined him on stage, he inquired whether or not she was afraid of death. If she confessed that she was, the Gentle reassured her that it was just a change of arrangements, like moving house. If the woman said that she wasn't afraid of death, the Gentle pivoted to the assembly and said, "She may feel differently before we're finished." He opened the door of the vestibule to allow a clear view of the empty, velvet-walled interior. He thumped on the walls inside and out, and the sounds were solid. Next, he invited the volunteer to join him within, promised the audience that they'd return shortly, and shut the door behind them. During the time that passed, perhaps 10 or 15 minutes, the quartet at the foot of the stage tuned their instruments. Soon they began to play a waltz. In the second or third measure, the door swung wide, and the conjurer and his volunteer assistant smoothly danced out onto the stage. They were altered, however. His head sat atop her neck, and hers atop his. While the crowd roared in terror and delight, the couple swept gracefully around and around. As the waltz neared its conclusion, the gentle dropped his head to his own shoulder, and the woman who wore his body in the lead danced them back into the vestibule. The door clapped shut behind them. When it reopened a minute or two later, Simon the Gentle and his dance partner stepped out with their heads restored to their own bodies. The conjurer grabbed the other's hand, and threw the woman, visibly dazed but otherwise unharmed except for a tiny puncture at the tip of her forefinger, forward in a low bow. The Gentle's performance thrilled the public, packing theaters, and everyone wondered what could be next. How could he stop the vestibule? How could he top the vestibule? He couldn't.
That's great. What I like about this is you think like there's so many little details here. Are these going to be picked up later? And they all are.
Yeah, I think that I always refer to this, and I should check the quote sometime, but I remember reading something that David Foster Wallace wrote that was along the lines of, as a reader, you learn something on page 25, and then when it picks up again on page 100, you feel so smart.
Yeah.
And I really connect to that feeling, because that might be my number one pleasure when I'm reading a book, is when I'm like, oh, it's all coming together now. Like this story has grown this leg. And so in the writing of the Curator, I think a lot of novelists, something will happen and then they'll go back and they'll retrofit the detail so that they're like, oh, somebody's got to have a trumpet on page 220, so we're going to have to put that back in.
Yep.
But for me, what I sort of do it opposite, which is, this is sad for my editor. I will, my poor editor Joe, I will there's a scene, the horrible university student, at one point Dee goes to his empty apartment, and when I first wrote the book, I just was like, well, I'm going to put a bunch of stuff in this guy's room because something's going to come in handy later. And so, I had it was a knife under the bed. There was money under like a board. There were,
a candlestick.
Yeah, there was all kinds of shit in this room. And then once I got rolling a little bit long, and I was like, oh, well, the only thing that actually is important is there's a tooth in there's a single tooth inside his bedside drawer. It's like everything else has got to go. And so I do it the other way around. I've got to go erase all these details and just have the one. But I like to seed all that stuff in and then see what sparks. But that is a lot of work later on to make sure that I didn't overload the book with aggressive details. I'm sure that I overloaded it with a few.
No, I mean, that's something that I feel like my friends in school and I would talk about a ton, is like making the reader feel smart. Like that's always I feel like that's always the sign of a really good and also like really satisfying and also entertaining book. I think about this a lot with television because I'm like very sleep deprived, and television usually makes me feel dumb. So if I ever feel like, oh no, she's gonna come back, no, then I feel great because it's like, oh, they've plotted it in such a way to make me not feel like quite so much of an idiot. But I think this is really.
That's why it drove me crazy in The Sopranos when the Russian guys and the Pine Barrens never came back.
Yeah.
Like they just went running into the woods, and man, I was religiously watching that show. Just like I was enjoying the show, but like at the start of every episode, I was like, I hope those guys come back this episode.
Damn it.
I mean, in a way, it's beautiful that he just refused to let me have that, because I never stopped thinking
He was
of
thinking
it.
specifically about you.
Yes, he was like David Chase was like, yeah, I'm not going to give him that.
Yeah. Well, I think we're almost ready to open it up to the audience, but before we do, I do need to ask you about cats.
Sure.
First, let's talk about how cats operate in the book, but I also want to know why cats and how cats operate in your life.
Well, first off, I should say, I know that for a lot of people, anthropomorphism is no, not doing it, and I totally get. It's not a problem for me. There's a bunch of anthropomorphic stories and novels that I love. But in this book, the cats aren't anthropomorphized. We see them do things. There's one specific cat. There's 3 famous hotels in the city, and each hotel has its a cat that has the same name, and then they just, whenever it dies, they get a new one. And it has a number. So the cat that's important to the book is Talmadge 17, so she's just 17. And we follow 17 as she, for at least one whole chapter, we just see her doing different things. And there's a lot that hopefully the reader thinks that the things that she's doing mean, but she's also just being a cat and like staring at stuff and killing little animals and just being super, super present. And just appearing also very abruptly. So in that way, I tried to make her and all the other cats real and a little bit feral too. And then more broadly in the city, especially people of the lower classes worship cats, and people of the lower classes worship cats, and they have a whole religion set up around cats, and they feed the stray cats, and the cats are kind of holy figures in the city, which makes some of the richer people super mad, for reasons that are different than maybe we think at first. But anyway, so that's what happens in the book, and I love cats, and we have cats. But they're different than the cats in the book because they're so domesticated, and the cats in the book, even the hotel cats, are vicious. So yeah, that's the story. I have a story. My wife Kelly Braffett, who's a wonderful novelist and an expert cat trainer. She would, as much as they can be trained. We had 2 guinea pigs and 2 cats, and I was like, we can't get a 3rd cat. We've just got too many pets. And Kelly's like, well, what if one comes to the door? And I was like, yeah, well, if one comes to the door, we're not going to let it die, so we can have that. But that's like the only exception. And so she like made one appear with her mind. And then, we got this little cat that came to the door one day. And at the time, Kelly had COVID. And so she was isolating from us, mostly on the porch in her overcoat, like making friends with the kitten that had come to the door. And then we trapped it on the porch, and now we have it in the house, and it's like a friend, It's like our pal, and doesn't want to go outside. But that cat is actually a lot like the cats in the book.
Nice. Didn't know.
She's been slaying little creatures all over the place.
Yeah. Cats know how to get their needs met.
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome. Well, I think this could be a good time to open it up to you all. I have more questions that I can go to if needed, but I feel like you probably have some good ones. So let's see what you got. I think there's a mic that will. Yes. Hi. Thank you.
So you can just raise your hand, and we'll be over to you with a microphone.
Hi, yeah, I'm curious about how you worked with the editor at the publishing house. Did you have an editor during the composition process? Did you go through drafts after the book was acquired? What was the process?
Well, I didn't have an editor at Scribner anymore. The editors I work with have left. So what was great was they wanted to do the book, and my editor on the book came over from Saga Press, which is a fantasy imprint of Simon & Schuster, and his name is Joe Monti. Joe's here tonight. And so Joe, heroically pinch hit and worked on the book and came upstairs and, got it, I think, right away what I was hoping to achieve, and helped me iron out some. The book gets pretty dreamlike in the late portions of the story, and I think what Joe really wanted to make sure of was that we had all the wheels of the narrative moving forward with lots of momentum by the time things got super, super weird. And he was instrumental in reorganizing a few chapters and getting me to add a couple of things in the middle that clarified some of the secrets that get revealed. So it was a great experience. It was a little bit, like all book editing experiences, there's always something that's really hard, and there were a couple things that were really hard, but it was also fun because you get in there and you feel inspired by, hopefully, if it's a good experience, you feel inspired by the things that your editor suggests, and feel inspired by the problems. Like, how am I going to fix this? I got to come up with something good, and you get excited about it.
Thank you.
Hi, Owen.
Oh, hey, Travis.
You've talked before about how music influences things that you write.
Uh-huh.
Were you listening to anything in particular when you wrote this?
Well, it's funny. As I've gotten older, it definitely seems to be connected. I have to have like absolute silence while I'm writing, like extra silence. I wear like noise blocking headphones. It's dork city. I got like these huge headphones, these huge cans on my head, and like white noise buzzing in. But I do listen to. I think of like a lot of Tom Waitsy kind of music, and that was to like get in the mood for it. But I can't. Time is finite, so I couldn't like listen to a whole record or anything like that. But I listen to a couple songs and then be like, all right, I'm ready to go. So yeah, for sure.
Do you write in coffee shops ever?
I have, and it's actually worked pretty good, but I haven't in a while.
Yeah, I used to love it, and that was like the only thing I would do because I felt like I needed to get out of my house. And then obviously for several years I could not do that ever. So I recently started again, but I discovered like now my brain is kind of wrecked. Because I'm just so obsessed with what everyone is saying, and I just like want to hear about their lives. I'm like, what's your daughter doesn't want to go to school today? Oh, yeah. So I feel like I just need to go back to my room.
How do you feel about people seeing, walking by your computer and seeing your screen and like, because when I walk by people's screens in coffee shops, it's like I have to be like, don't look at what they're doing, but I really want to look at what they're doing.
I am almost always drafting longhand, and my handwriting is so bad that I don't believe that anyone could decipher it. So I think I'm safe.
Okay.
Have you ever seen anything good on someone's screen?
When I lived in Brooklyn, there was, I don't even know if they have these anymore. There was like, it was a mail place, but it also had like computers you could use by the hour or something like that. And I once got in line and I could see that the woman was writing like a just marvelously crazy letter to the federal government about something to do with what's the conspiracy theory about the clouds, the
chemtrails.
Yeah, it had something to do with chemtrails. And I probably should have paid more attention
because then you would know what's facing us from above.
I was hiding from it. I didn't want to face up to that.
Yep.
Yeah, that was the one time, but it was something.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good one. Do we have other cues out there? Because I have more. I'm warning you.
Oh no.
You guys think? We got one.
I guess this can be for both of you. When you're writing and you're doing your research, how do you not fall down the rabbit hole and think about all the little things that could, like, people might ask later on? And I feel like now, especially with the internet, there's all those like YouTube videos of like what you missed in this. How do you like, not fall down those holes?
You start.
I try to find details that aren't that easy to get on the internet. It's like I do all my research on paper pretty much. It was all from books for the most part, or I like to look at, for this book, I like to go to the New York Public Library and they have this massive photo database, and I would just like look at photos of people doing stuff in the 1880s and 1890s and 1900s and just sort of think about what the backgrounds of the photographs look like and what the clothes look like, and also just like what the expressions of the people look like and how it seemed like they were interacting in the photographs. So I try to do research like that that's more impressionistic, and then when I do details, I try to just find a few particular things. I don't want to get obsessed because that's like it's a novel, not a nonfiction report. Right. So only a few telling details are really important to the story. And if you find yourself just raining details, correct details down in the book, then it's going to be slow, and you don't want it to be. My book especially has a lot of setup. It's already a little bit slow, so you don't want it to be molasses.
I didn't find it slow, but I did think when you were talking about like luckily this isn't set, in a real place. I had a similar. I mean, my book is also not set in a real place. It's set in a fake version of the American West in fake 1894. My most recent book, and that's also the book I did the most research for. But it's also a book where I was like, well, if I get anything wrong, I'll just be like, oh, but this isn't the real world. Sorry,
Right.
I don't know why you thought that you could trust me in any way. I did get emails. My editor actually had me change something for the paperback, which was the book is about a midwife. It's about a midwife and her daughter, an apprentice midwife, and there's a part where they're advising people about how to get pregnant, and they're like tracking someone's fertility across the month. And someone wrote in and said, do you think that in 1894 people would have known about this? And I was about to be like, well, this is not real 1894, so everything's fine. And then I was kind of like, well, actually, let me look into this. I think I decided that it could stand because I felt like a lot of things like that, if you look back, people have sort of had folk knowledge for centuries and millennia, even if they didn't understand, like, this is what ovulation is or whatever. But it was interesting that even it will not fully get you out of email, emails about your research being wrong if you just had things not in real life. So
Did you have to ride horses or feel it? You had to ride horses?
So this was a bummer. I really wanted to ride. I hadn't ridden a horse since I was a child, and I really wanted to. But like most of when I was writing the book, I was pregnant. So I wasn't sure I could safely ride a horse, and I also wasn't sure I could safely shoot a gun, which was another thing I felt like I should try. So I didn't do either of those things, and I had to just kind of like pretend. I have ridden a horse in my life. I have not ever shot a gun.
You had that too, yeah.
Yeah.
I did magic.
You switched your head with someone else's head.
I dabbled a little in sorcery, but nothing too dangerous.
Yeah. Eat some bad oysters from the river.
Right.
Well, I have one more that I wanted that I want to do while other folks think if they have others, which is let's talk about work. So much of this is set in the Museum of the Worker, and there's also, without giving too much away, there's this character in the book who's a hard worker, and he's extremely bad.
Yeah.
So, and it's also, it's a book that's like deeply engaged with class and engaged with revolution. Talk to me about like work and workers in this book.
Well, I think that I thought it was kind of one of the things that Dee notices is that the museum, and this is where most of the research went into where most of my research was in learning what the jobs were that people were doing in the 1880s and 1890s, because she is at this museum, this strange museum, and there are all these wax workers at work doing period correct jobs. And at the same time, it's as if no one's been in the museum for 30 years. And it's somewhat indicative of the way that the very wealthiest people in the city and in the country have come to regard the people that do the jobs. That it's something that doesn't matter to them. And so that's sort of a metaphorical thing, because of course, and one of the things that Dee's lover is a revolutionary, and he complains early in the book about how the museum's in bad shape, so no one would want to go. And she's like, why would people want to go see themselves at work? Like, you want to use your day off to go do something fun. Like, why would you want to go see a wax figure, shoveling shit?
Right.
And so that's kind of the way it is. But then, of course, the hard worker is hard at work, killing lots of people, and so he's a different kind of worker. And really, the idea with him is that sometimes when there's vast amounts of chaos, political chaos in a country, people who are deeply disturbed can somehow find themselves in a position of authority and kind of go unnoticed, and that's what happens.
Makes sense. A very disturbing part of the book and reality.
All right,
Thank you all so much.
One more question.
We have one more. Okay.
For young writers who are interested in stories where they are doing world building, because both of you have talked about that a lot tonight, Do you have just a couple of tips that maybe you've learned along the way, including maybe some tips on how to ask for feedback on early drafts?
About world building. Well, I think that you want to, if at all possible, it really depends on the kind of world you're building. But because for mine, it's not like there's nobody who was alive then to talk to, right? But you want to find some people who have some knowledge of the thing that you're creating. And it's the same with you. It's not like there's no Old West cowboys to talk to.
Right.
But you can talk to somebody that has studied that history and somebody that knows about riding horses and things like that, and say, does this ring true to you? And if it doesn't, then you've really got to fix it.
Yeah, for me, I think it's different for every book and for every world. Certainly for Outlawed, which is the book that was set in the fake West, a lot of building the world was building the voice. And as soon as I could sort of hear the voice in my head, I felt like, okay, yes, I have this voice that feels like it's not contemporary. I'm not worried this is like at that time, 2019 or whatever voice. I have a voice that feels like it's from the past or from another world. And then I can kind of use that to, wiggle my way into this weird headspace. And I get the sense that this has aspects of that too, especially when you're talking about like reading text from the period to get that in your head.
And that's I think that's central to every book. Is just like, how is this book going to sound? And that's the hardest part, is because unless you have that right, you're just accomplishing very little.
Yeah.
You just have to keep writing and writing and writing until the voice sounds right, and then you can go, and then everything else is like 20 times easier than it was before.
Yeah. I'm also pretty obsessive about physical space and blocking, partly because I think it does not come naturally to me and I'm bad at it. So I think a lot about like, where do the streets intersect? It would be like, if I had to write a book about an unmappable city, I feel like I would do such a bad job. Where do the streets intersect? Where is the person standing in the room? I do draw a lot of maps. I make a lot of lists. And I think that can be really helpful. And I don't know, in terms of how to ask for feedback, like what do you think about that?
You have to find some readers who get what you want to do, and that you think will be honest with you. One thing that I love to do is try to find, every time I finish a book, try to find somebody to read it who I really respect, but who doesn't know me that well, so they're not invested in me, and make a trade with them. So I read their book and they read mine, and then you get some, because all your closest readers at least like you and care about you and may soft pedal it, but hopefully that person, that stranger or quasi stranger whose work you respect and who seems really smart will, give you a really truthful read, a really straightforward read.
If you guys have read Private Citizens by Tony Tulatimoudi, I rely on him to be my friend but not soft pedal anything or be nice at all. So I recommend you just reach out to him. I'm sure he'll read all your books. Like, it's fine.
Yeah.
But no, I think my like one tip would also be not to give stuff out too early.
Yep.
If there's still stuff you can fix or stuff that you're really unsatisfied with and you know what to do, then you're still working on it yourself. And if you start bringing in feedback at that point, it can be really distracting. It can be dispiriting, or it can be like your friends are like, "This is great," and then you're like, "Okay, I'm done," but you're not done. So just to sit with your own stuff for a while.
And you don't want to use up your really good readers either, because there's diminishing returns. And somebody that really, really cares about you might read the book 7 times, but like, what are they really giving you the last 5?
Right.
Because it's hard to see a book when you read it over and over again. Like, can you really detect what's different and things like that?
Right. I think that's right. Thank you again, everybody. This was amazing.
Let's give them a hand. All right, so you can just go out those back doors and go to the bookstore and grab your books. If you're one of the 3 lucky people who want a book, I'll meet you in the back of the room, and I'll bring Anna and Owen around so you guys can chat and get your books personalized. Thanks so much.
Great. I thought that was good.
Yeah,
Thank
that
you,
was
Anna.
fun.
That was really good. You had really good questions. How do you keep all that in your? I always have to have like a cheat sheet?
I had it on my phone, and then I'm like slightly embarrassed to look at my phone, so that's how I do it. I use embarrassment.